Ah, the past. Truly it was the worst, full of humans doing dumb things, then spending way too long defending our decisions and trying to convince people that no, trust me, it wasn't really that dumb. This is a recurring theme on another channel that I run called Business Blaze, which you should consider subscribing to. It's mostly about business, but also, it's not really about business at all. I guess you have to see for yourself. My writer on that channel, his name is Danny. He'll write me a script on a topic that's critical to the survival of humanity. For example, social media mistakes that destroyed people's lives, or terribly misogynist advertisements from 100 years ago, or maybe just a little conspiracy video about the lizard people. But whatever the script is about, I read it and react to it on camera. Anyway, I'll leave a link in the description below. Check it out. It's quite fun. And now today's video. There's a popular saying that starts, "If I knew then what I knew now." The idea is that you've grown and learned in the present, and you could have used that knowledge to do things better in the past. This works on an individual level, but also for society as a whole. In the past, humanity was prone to do some preposterous things. We could look back now and realize how silly, awful, and weird some of those practices truly were. Number 10. Gun classes in elementary school. In Indiana in 1956, there was a brief period of time when young children were being shown how to use guns in the classroom. Today, that idea would be considered laughable if it wasn't also vaguely terrifying. Any responsible gun owner should want their child to understand gun safety. But do you really want it being taught at school by someone else who may not be responsible, among other children who are also probably not responsible? Given the modern view of guns in schools and the fact that kids have to do active shooter drills so they can respond to an armed intruder in a school, this idea is a modern parent's nightmare. It seems like the potential for abuse or accidents is very high. Pictures from these classes show children under 10 years of age using rifles and shotguns in the class. Is it possible they were loaded? Perhaps, but images also show police officers conducting the course, firing them in front of kids as well, so live ammo is a part of the process. Is it wrong to teach kids responsible gun handling? No, not at all. But having it taught in public school with no parental guidance does seem to be a bit of a potential danger. When you look at the history of school shootings and see that there were a number of shootings in the 1950s as well, both accidental and intentional, it becomes more clear why guns in schools should probably not be mixed. Number 9. Swaddling babies. There are a whole host of things we have learned that are not good for babies and that we used to just think were primo, from cages installed outside of windows that babies could sit in to mercury as a method of teething relief. It's kind of amazing that any of the babies from the past ever grew up. One of the more recent about faces we've made in childcare relates to swaddling. Many cultures have practiced this for ages, wrapping a baby up like a tiny human burrito to make them feel safe and secure. So what's the problem? Literally thousands, if not millions of people alive today were swaddled as babies and turned out fine. The problem is the ones that didn't turn out fine. Professionals admit that if you swaddle a baby properly, it may help them sleep better and feel more secure. But it's that pesky if that's the problem. If you do it wrong, there's an increased risk of hypothermia, hip dysplasia, and sudden infant death syndrome. And the problem is that most people who do it wrong think they're doing it right. Number 8. Human waste management. In today's world, we definitely take plumbing and sanitation for granted. There was a time when flushing a toilet was not an option though, and back then, not everything we did to clean up waste was necessarily a good idea. There's a popular belief that in medieval times and beyond, people simply tossed a chamber pot out of the window to dump whatever nastiness they had done in an alley. There are also a number of history-themed articles that refute this claim. After all, the smell of human waste was as unpleasant back then as it is today, so the story goes that people did not do this as a common practice. But it must be noted that a common practice is doing a lot of the work in that sentence. Cities in England had established fines of people caught throwing waste in the street outside of their houses. That implies that it happens enough to necessitate fine. And even when it was not being disposed of in the least sanitary manner, the most sanitary manner was not sanitary either. In many towns, residents took a bucket to a stream to dump their daily waste. That's not the best solution, and when you have hundreds of thousands of people living in a single town, it creates some of the most foul streams and rivers imaginable. There's a street in modern-day Essex called Shoot Street that earned its name for a word that sounds vaguely like shoot, but smells a lot worse. It was because a brook ran down the street that carried away all the sewage of the town. Number 7. Hysteria treatment. For well over 4,000 years, the idea that women suffered from a condition called hysteria was widespread. There are writings of it that date back to 1900 BC in Egypt. They believed it was caused by spontaneous uterus movements. The condition itself was a vague one with a variety of potential symptoms. Just about anything from anxiety to fluid retention to wanting too much sex or not enough sex could be considered hysterical. Rachel Maines has theorized that the invention of the vibrator was directly linked to treatment for female hysteria. The idea was that bringing women to orgasm, what doctors at the time referred to as a hysterical paroxysm, could cure the hysteria and allow a woman to get on with her life. Interestingly enough, though modern understanding makes this sexual, it was potentially not viewed that way in the past. There is also evidence to suggest doctors at the time were of the opinion that women would not receive any sexual pleasure from external stimulation, thus using a vibrator was strictly therapeutic. Maybe that was just something they said so as to not look licentious at the time. Now we realize that most of these women considered hysterical were probably suffering from a vast array of other conditions. It was just the bizarrely wrong-headed belief that almost everything afflicting a woman could be the same thing that led to hysteria being a single diagnosis. Number 6. Car seats. Although the automobile was invented in the 1800s, they didn't achieve widespread acceptance in America until the 1920s. Car safety was barely a thing for those first models. They were just metal boxes on wheels and accidents were common. Windshield wipers weren't even invented until 1903, meaning cars had mostly been helpless in the rain for around 15 years. By 1911, the idea of a rear-view mirror existed and turn indicators showed up in 1914. Padding on the dashboard didn't exist until 1947. The first car seat designed to keep children safe wasn't invented until 1962. Standards were not put in place until 1971. The first child car seat law wasn't on the books until 1979. In 1985, all states finally had laws about car seats. For around 40 years of heavy use, cars had just short of no way to keep a child safe. Seatbelts weren't even invented until the 1950s, and there had been early versions of car seats for kids, but not ones meant to keep them safe. Instead, early car seats were booster seats so the child could see out of the windows and be kept in one place. Even today, the CDC says that over 600,000 children under 12 are riding in cars with no restraints each year. Number 5. People as decorations. Human history is full of horrible, heartbreaking examples of the terrible ways we can treat one another. From slavery to genocide to eugenics and more, our species has a knack for doing awful things. Not every example of using and abusing other humans ended with so much bloodshed, however. For instance, there's the practice of garden hermits. The idea of exploiting another human as a decoration is something most of us would consider incredibly wrong today. In the 18th century, it was a sign, though, of affluence and culture. The garden hermit was a real, live human who was paid to live in the garden. They would have a shack or other dwelling referred to as a hermitage, and their job was to just live there. They might be asked to wear a costume such as that of a druid, and it was expected that they would not bathe for years on end. Their hair and nails would grow long, and the landowner could show them off to their friends. The reasons behind the garden hermit are as peculiar as the practice itself. Melancholy was considered a primo state of being back in the day, and a hermit embodied that in spades. They could display somberness and dedication to their solitude in a way that made them admirable. That it was all something of an act, at least insofar as the fact that they were dressed up and being paid, just didn't seem to matter. Number 4. Hazardous waste disposal. Toxic waste isn't a term you hear much anymore. Hazardous waste is considered a more appropriate description, but for years this incredibly dangerous waste material was something that we had essentially no way of dealing with. The Industrial Revolution brought with it pollution on a mass scale. Heavy metals, nuclear waste, asbestos, pesticides, and other toxic byproducts have been a side effect of industry for over 100 years. For a time it was newsworthy when a company was caught dumping this stuff into waterways, but if that wasn't happening, the world just stopped and turned a blind eye. The fact is, most toxic waste was put in dumps for decades. Barrels of hazardous substances that we hoped would go away are at risk of leaking and/or are actively leaking waste today. Hanford Nuclear Reservation houses 56 million barrels of waste underground that are leaking and polluting the earth. Modern techniques for dealing with toxic waste are at least trying to ameliorate the environmental impact. Recycling plays a large part in trying to lessen the volume of waste. The other big method of handling hazardous waste now is treatment. Just like adding baking soda to an acid can neutralize it, there are chemicals and other processes that can neutralize toxic waste. Various methods include incineration, metabolization with microbes, filtration, and evaporation to reduce volume, and so on. Number 3. Mental illness. Treating any kind of mental illness with a lobotomy is something we know today is extremely wrong. That was just the tip of the iceberg in terms of wrong-headed thinking when it came to mental illness in the past, however. And while we still don't have a full understanding of the human brain and how it works, for the most part, we know not to blame evil spirits. That's not true of everyone in the modern world, but most mental health professionals aren't going to blame schizophrenia on Satan these days. Unfortunately, for much of human history, that wasn't the case. Ancient Persians believed evil spirits caused mental illness, and you could prevent such conditions with good thoughts. Ancient Hebrews thought it was the the wrath of God. Mesopotamians thought it was demonic possession, and a ritualistic exorcism could fix you right up. In the 17th century, a good deal of women persecuted as witches may have got the label due to the exhibition of any behavior considered abhorrent, which would have included mental illness. In ancient India, some believed mental illness was evidence of sins in past lives. Although some societies of the past had semi-enlightened views of mental illness, or at least were beginning to understand that it wasn't demonic in nature, treating them was still difficult. Egyptians tried to occupy the mentally ill with tasks like painting and dancing, creative endeavors to try to ease their troubles. It may not have cured anything, but it was certainly better than cutting out pieces of the brain. Today, we at least understand the concepts of chemical imbalances, genetic disorders, brain trauma, and other causes of mental illness. It's been a long and difficult road, however. Number 2, seatbelts. We've already seen our car seats were a struggle, but the war on seatbelts took the opposition to safety to new lows. People actively hated the idea of seatbelts. In fact, there is a good comparison between the introduction of seatbelts and the introduction of masks during the COVID-19 pandemic. While some were quick to adopt the measures recommended by authorities, others took it as an attack on their freedom. Only 2% of car buyers opted to have one back in 1946 when Ford made them an option. In 1968, the National Highway Traffic and Safety Act mandated all vehicles include seatbelts, something Ralph Nader had accused automakers of ignoring to increase profits. A full 65% of Americans opposed seatbelts in the 1980s. In 1983, only 15% of Americans used them. New York was the first state to make using them a law, and that didn't happen until 1984. People claimed wearing a seatbelt was inconvenient and uncomfortable. Some even suggested wearing one would be more dangerous in an accident, and that somehow being thrown free in a crash would be safer. The past was the worst. Times have changed, and most people today, about 90% of drivers, understand the value of the seatbelt. In 2017, nearly 15,000 lives were saved by them. Darwin Awards at work. Number 1, mailing children. The mail service has been a staple of life for generations. Even when email threatened to wipe it out, the post office persevered. And who doesn't feel a little thrill when they get a package in the mail? The mail service was definitely more exciting to past generations, and when the post office started offering the ability to send parcels in the mail, people were really into it. Bafflingly, dangerously into it. While today you might send a care package to a friend with some snacks and a sweater in it, back in 1913 people let their imaginations run wild with possibility. If you could send anything under a certain weight through the mail, well, why not a small human? And a Ohio couple were first to make the news when they tried to mail their 8-month-old daughter to his grandmother. They paid 15 cents, and apparently the postman took him for the few miles ride to grandma's house. Later, a young girl was sent with the mail on a train to visit her grandmother over 70 miles away because mail was cheaper than a train ticket. She, at least, had a chaperone on the train who worked for the company, which may have greased the wheels on that shady procedure a bit. The post office officially banned the practice, but there's evidence it still continued in some rural areas where people were willing to trust postal workers literally with their children's lives. One can only imagine the Twitter uproar today if someone tried to package their kid and give them to a FedEx driver. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe, and as always, thank you for watching.